Welcome back to another reading and correcting. I forgot to put. With me, Kendar, the Tiger Writes, and Ty, who almost was not at his post, the Tiger Supervisor. These are where I do actually, that's why. These are where I do a reading and correct. This is where I read a chapter from one of my books and correct it as I go. If you want to listen to these live and, listen to me screw up, it's every Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. Eastern Time on Twitch. And if you want to support me, that is on my Patreon. Today, we are doing Chapter 23 of Breaking Step. Oh, let me see if I got this right. Don looked from Tibs to the merchant suspiciously. You, Tibs, found out there was something special about the pool when you tried to hire an adventurer to remove it. One of the adventurers the guild brought in to clean up what was left of Sebastian's found? How? How do I go from house to found? From Sebastian's house after we attacked it. They brought in a number of corruption adventurers because of how much what I did to... Because... Okay, how... Because what I did to bring it down left so much behind. They brought in a number of corruption adventurers because what I did to bring it down. To bring it down left so much behind. He said, not sounding entirely certain, but there was no light on the words, so he did believe he'd been responsible. And you came to his... Yeah, I thought so. To this merchant for that. Daran said, smiling. Right. So you bought the pool for Tibs. After finding out who the official owner of the land the Garden Palace had stood on was, since the owner and family died in that incident. It was the guild, by the way. Tibs shrugged while Don stared at the merchant. Why? He asked in an exasperated tone. Darren stared back, not looking certain. Because if Tibs had gone to the guild directly, he, rightfully, worried they would have questioned his motive and realized the profits they could make from it. Not that, Don pointed to Tibs. Why buy it for him and not for yourself? Tibs asked me to buy it for him. The merchant sounded perplexed. He's a runner, you're a merchant. Money drives you, and it isn't like he'd have recourses to take anyway. Tibs isn't a runner, Duran stated. He's a customer, and I happen to think of him as a friend. Of course, Don scoffed, since he made sure you and the other merchants were protected from that criminal. I considered Tibs a friend well before then, and while money is indeed something I chased, too hard at the time, I also value relationships. Any serious merchant will value them. Really? Don mocked and motioned to the rest of the row. Then why the fuck am I not entitled to the same treatment everyone here seems to give Tibs? Darren studied the sorcerer before answering. Because of that word. Don looked at the merchant confused, then at Tibs, who shrugged. Entitled, Darren said with a sigh. You step into our shops and demand that we treat you right, that we give you the best we have to offer. I pay for what I ask for, Don replied, offended. Indeed, that, and your well-known taste for getting back at those. At those you feel have wronged you is why I expect no one has attempted to swindle you. You may be disagreeable, but you are honest. I'm not He closed his mouth on the faintly glowing retort. There was no light this time as he closed his mouth and deflated. I'm not like, he whispered. Fuck. As he ran a hand over his face. Why is it so fucking hard to be treated like a person in this place? Act like one, Tibbs said, and Don glared at him instead of a noble. The sorcerer's expression darkened, but he stayed silent. It can be difficult not to start acting like those you hate, Darren said, and Tibs raised an eyebrow. He hated nobles much more than Don ever would, and he never acted like them. What do you know? Dan asked uncertainly. Nothing of you in your history other than what I saw when you arrived. Suspicions. Suspicions cross the sorcerer's face, then he shrugged. Okay, fine. He turned his attention to Tibbs. And you want to sell me the pool? Why? And you want to sell me the pool? Why? It's not doing me any good. Corruption isn't my element. Darren bought it for me because I didn't want the guild to have it. By selling it to you, I get coins I can use to help the Omega runners. I don't have anything like the money you need for that. But you can get that from the sorceress and no, from the sorcerer. From the sorcerer and the people she talks for. So can you. Tib shook his head. She thinks you own the pool. She'll wonder why I didn't stop you. She might question why I bought it to start with. I don't know how friendly she is with the guild. Dawn snorted. So I'm nothing more than your agent, like him. I just want the coins I need to buy the equipment to make sure we can pay for the repairs. Darren knows how much I need. Anything else you get from her is yours. Minus my commission on assisting you with the contract and negotiation, Darren said. Unless you can outmaneuver a sorcerer without help. Don shook his head. You can handle those. But she'll use magic to get you to agree to her terms. I'm counting on you to keep her from succeeding, Darren said with a smile. And I'm not changing this, even though I have to change what comes later. Darren is letting this is Darren letting Dawn feel like he's going to be bringing something to the table. The nod from the sorcerer came with a certain expression, and you'll make sure nothing keeps Tibbs from getting his fair cut in the process. I trust you, Tibbs said as Darren opened his mouth to lie. Why? Dawn asked in surprise. You're my teammate. And that's enough? Tibbs shrugged. If nothing else, I'll find out if you're honest about wanting to be better. Tibbs knew Don meant it, but he also knew how easy it was to slip into old habits. All he needed was to look at all he'd done with fire after promising he'd never channel it. Don studied him. Oh, no, actually, I had it right. Don's studying of him took a long time. No, studied him for a long time. While the phrasing, the tense was correct for the phrasing, I don't like the phrasing. Don studied him for a long time before nodding. All right, you get your coins, I get my money, and whatever else I can get out of them. The first thing we have to make sure is that I don't end up indentured to the academy past my apprentice stage. You're letting them own you even for that? Tibs asked. It's how things are done, the sorcerer replied. Even if I joined an academy as a scholar, I'd have spent close to a decade being nothing more than a servant to a master of the craft while I learned enough about how to do my own research and associated studies. I don't know how long it'll be as a sorcerer. The ones who have noted that in their writings makes it sound like it's more about my capability and then an established process. However long it takes, it will be shorter than what I take repaying the guild. So yes, I'm okay with it. Good, Darren smiled. Are you willing to open the negotiation demanding the entirety of the abyss? Dawn's confusion was quickly replaced with determination. You know how to handle negotiations, so I have no choice but, he took a breath. I am trusting you to get me the best that can be gotten out of them. The merchant clapped a hand on Don's shoulder. I do like this new you. We are going to have fun skimming absolutely everything we can off those academician. But you aren't scamming Don on my behalf, Tibbs stated, knowing Darren would see this as a challenge to get Tibbs everything he could. The merchant hurt. I would never do such a. Would I ever do such a thing? Yes, Tibbs and Don said in unison, him completely serious while the sorcerer sounded amused. Well, Darren replied, sounding far more offended than Tibbs knew him to be. I have never. Yes, you have. Tibbs cut him off, and the merchant chuckled, then grinned. What's your plan? Don asked as they walked. Go along with what Tyrannia wants. Tibbs wore a dark blue sleeveless doublet over a pale blue tunic with leather pants and hard boots in the same dark blue. The one thing he wore that didn't match were his bracers. The clothier had tried to talk him into leaving them behind. They were under. The tunic's laced sleeves. That had been her compromise to Tibbs' refusal. That could make things worse. Don's robe was the usual dark purple. It had been the detail he and the clothier had argued about. She wanted him in something not so dark. She'd gotten him to relent slightly so that the robe was trimmed in gold and silver. What do you think about it? What do you think it's about? Tibbs asked. I don't know. Don wasn't happy to admit that. I wasn't able to find out who the invitations were for. She dealt with those personally, so the people I know within the administration couldn't help me. So everyone will be important, like other guild leaders, or the person giving her orders. They'll definitely be important, but I don't see why she'd want us there for a meeting with other guild leaders. What do you know about the enchantment protecting the building? The building was becoming visible at the end of the road. Don glanced at Tibbs. Nothing. The guild doesn't let that kind of information be talked about. Isn't something like that hard? Isn't that kind of shipment? Isn't that kind of, because if I just say that thing, it could refer to the information. Isn't that kind of enchantment hard? The sorcerer chuckled. It's the kind of thing that kings can't afford. I expect the guild makes sure their best sorcerers stay with them just so they can make those. Tibbs studied as more details of the crate-like building became visible. The roof was lined with a battlement, the windows narrow enough only the thinnest of rogues could slip through them if they could undo the enchantments that covered them. Same as with every surface. Again, he focused on what he sensed, trying to at least make out which elements were part of the weave, but it was so tight he couldn't make out the usual difference between them. Adventurers in regalia of gold and black, just like the one who had shown up at the room's door, stood on each side of the entrance. One had metal as her essence, the other's eyes were a dark red Tibbs had never seen before. Both were epsilon. Let's lengthen the phrase. Both were epsilon, and they nodded as Tibbs and Dawn entered. The attendant inside, his clothing also in gold and black, looked at them over. His eyes were the multiple shifting colors of crystal. Tibbs sensed essence being sent at them. This was only a vision. No, okay, didn't sense essence being sent at them. This was only a visual evaluation. He nodded and motioned to one of the clerks, also in gold and black. This one with the green eyes of wood, and she led them deeper into the building. As with every time he stepped into the guild building, Tibbs counted his step, matching them to the door they passed. After 6, the number no longer matched his memory. Then he realized he'd miscounted, and there was no point in continuing. The previous time, he attributed that to inattention on his part, but now he figured it was part of the building's enchantment. It would make it difficult for anyone to case the place and plan a break-in. Their escort opened the door to a room after Tibbs didn't know how many turns onto a room. Okay. I'm going to change the way that after, because this feels more like a abrupt cut than just a nested clause. Their escort opened the door to a room after Tibbs didn't know how many turns onto a room that seemed too large to fit into the building. People dressed fancier than Tibbs and Don looked in their directions, then went back to their conversations. In that glance, Tibbs recognized the dismissiveness of noble, the evaluation of merchant, amused look from those who recognized what Tibbs and Don represented, and other expression he couldn't decipher. There were more people than Tibbs expected, and he could count the number of them who had an element other than the guards that lined the wall on one hand. On the left wall, Tibbs was certain was further away than the last turn in that direction. A long table had raised trays filled with plates of food, as well as crystal decanters and goblets filled with colorful liquids. Fancy alcohols, he expected. Tyrannia was before them, and before Tibbs could move was in front of them before Tibbs could move. I am so pleased you could make it. She wore a green vest of heavy fabric with crystal randomly sewn to it. None of them had essence. Her pants were black, and the buckle of her belt was an amulet with a reserve so deep, Tibbs wasn't sure he could tell the difference between it and his own. I wouldn't have missed this, Dawn answered in polite neutrality, and Tibbs nodded. Come. She led them to the center of the room as essence gathered there. She climbed the forming crystal steps and stopped in the center of the transparent dais. She cleared her throat and the room quiet. Thank you for coming, she said. I know that the events of the previous months have not made the town of Craggle Rock an attractive prospect as a place for you to send those who need training. I know that some of the decisions that had to be taken to ensure the protection of the dungeon did not cast the guild and me specifically in the best light. So again, thank you for accepting my invitation. She let the murmur quiet on their own. The reason for this gathering is so I can explain why I was able to make the decisions I did, why I put the guild on the task of keeping the dungeon safe at what it might have appeared to be the town's expense. She placed a hand on Tibbs and Don's shoulder. This is Tibbs Lightfinger, Water Rogue, and Don Erebus, Corruption Sorcerers. You may have heard the names already. They are the heroes of Craggle. Craggle Rock. It has to be the full name. They are the heroes of Craggle Rock. Each is responsible not for one act of heroism, but two. Tibbs took on attackers intent on destroying the dungeon by himself. He slowed their progress enough the guild was able to stop them altogether before they could succeed. Dawn chased away the man who tried to take the town, who was able to infiltrate the guards and use them to disrupt and sow disrupt and discord. Then, together, they protected the town when that same man returned to wipe it from the world. The responses from the attendee was a mix of scoffs and appreciation. They are the reason I was able to focus on keeping the dungeon safe. They allowed the guild to not fall for the distraction the attacks on the town were meant to be. Her words were so bright, Tibbs saw it without having to look in her direction. Yes, the town suffered. We lost runners, we lost people. But I knew I could rely on these two fine examples of what it means to be runners, to act and keep as many as possible safe. They looked after the town so that the guild could look after the dungeon. She looked the people over. These are the kind of people we train here. Not simply those Not simply those who run the dungeon and gain strength from it, but who can make hard decisions. The kind of decisions you will need with when when your enemies come calling. I do not promise I do not promise easy training the the way other guild leaders do. Strength with little else. Our dungeon is hungry and it will take its toll. You know what I've had to do to bring in new runners? Because of that, you have questioned why you should send your sons and daughters. Why send retainers here to die here? She pushed Tibs and Don a step forward. These are why. A hard dungeon produces more than strong runners. It molds hard runners. The type to walk into enemy camp and remove the threat to those they protect. The kind of runners who become adventurers capable of doing whatever is needed to keep you safe. The silence that followed was long and filled with looks directed at Tibs. This time, they weren't dismissing him. She'd used him. Tibs knew that. She'd used him and Dawn to excuse her action and make it seem like they would gain more than they would lose. That if the town was attacked again, town was attacked again, they would be safe still. She used him and Dawn to get them to feed more people to Stowe, and he still stood straighter under those gaze. They were seeing someone worthy of their attention, someone to be watched and treated with care. They weren't seeing the boy from the street. They were seeing Tib's light fingers. Light fingers, plural. Some of the ice melted, and he smiled as he saw the concern in their eyes. And this concludes chapter 23 of Breaking Step. If you are enjoying this, please leave a like. If you want to know when the next one's going to be up, subscribe and hit the bell. If you want to read the story as well as the other in the series, they are up on Royal Road, available for free. If you want to support me and read ahead of Royal Road, that is on my Patreon. And if you want to listen to these live, it's every Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. Eastern Time on Twitch. The links are in the note. And with that, I shall wish you a good day.